I'm not comparing immigrants to snails.
Where did all these snails come from? Who let them in?
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't feel war. I just own halfway to Siwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
Andy, welcome back.
Hey Roger, how you going?
Good. It's been a little while. We've had a little hiatus.
What were you off to doing?
Well, my was work related, so not much fun. What about you?
I am just trying to think what I did do. I went to the Gold Coast and saw Guns N' Roses.
That would explain your lovely hue.
I think Axel's 60 years old, and I guess the rest of them are around the same age. They're still sort of rocking out like they're.
How does that affect?
Maybe not in their 20s, but maybe 30s. 30s
How does that
or
affect
40s.
the show though, knowing that they're that old?
Well, yeah, but you just kind of ignore that. You pretend it's not a thing. You pretend you're seeing like Axel with his locks down to his shoulders and bike shorts and the like.
Yeah,
but Slash still looks cool. Slash is still.
I know the hat was a good idea for him, right? Ages well, can cover up her. Just all you see is just hair and hat, so it's all good.
Well, the interesting thing is he wears his top hat, full time, and his sunglasses full time, like the whole show. Whereas he never used to do that. So, in fact, he would only wear the hat as like a gimmick on like one song or something. And now it's like, no, it's I don't know. He must have like sewed it onto his.
It's got double-sided tape.
Yeah,
it's part of like. Do you reckon it's one of those things, like where the hair's attached and he's just bald underneath, and he just like puts it on?
It could be an elaborate wig. Yeah, it could be hiding like a bald patch or something.
Well. Yeah, I always find it weird, like those kind of old rockers, and certain music probably holds better than others. But I don't know what was the racial kind of makeup of the audience, if you don't mind me asking.
I didn't. Well, I mean, I think just.
Or do you not see race?
Well, just to make one thing clear, the racial makeup of the Gold Coast is like 99% white. So,
why do you think Guns N' Roses doesn't appeal to racial audiences?
Well, can I just make one point? On the stage, you have a black drummer, a black guitarist, a female keyboardist. So this is like all about diversity. This band.
Yeah, that's a good comeback. Okay, let's kind of bring it back to interest. So, 2 weeks out, and we're already out of practice, right? So. What did you think about our last episode? Because I know for a fact that you've done a little bit of homework since we last spoke in the form of listening to a few Archetypes episodes.
Yeah, I listened to because I did think, we obviously slagged off. Well, I slagged off Megan.
Yeah, don't bring me into this. I'm already in enough trouble.
So look, I would say one thing I'd say is like so. Part of this is the middle, and we're trying to give both sides of the story. So after I was thinking, did we really give her the or did we present the other side of her story? I mean, I went in pretty well. My view, like my actual view on her, is quite cynical and skeptical. But I guess, did we give the other side, or did we present what is the more generous interpretation or view, rather than because I read a Piers Morgan article about her podcast, and their riff on it. I thought, well, I better actually listen to it myself, and
mate, I couldn't defend her anymore, otherwise I'd be risk being called a simp. So anyway, what did you think after listening to a little bit more of the Meghan Markle podcast?
I think a lot of the criticism of it is very much picking out that isolated one line that is a bit actually quite tone deaf, right? So because I read like reporting on it where it refers to her, like, she said this in the podcast and how outrageous or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like it is cherry picked. So it's not all just like wall to wall. You want to throw up, which is what I think I said. But at the same time, I would still say, like, I can't imagine how anyone would actually want to listen to that for their listening pleasure. Like,
I think it overtook the Joe Rogan Experience for a week or two.
yeah.
Can you believe that?
Well, I think there's probably a big curiosity factor. I mean, the difference between her and Joe Rogan is still not mainstream. Like, he's got this cult following, and there's a lot of people who listen to him and very like dedicated and loyal, and he'd have the same number of listeners every single week. But he doesn't have that broad. Like, there would still be people, like, if you go out on the street in a shopping center and said, "Do you know who Joe Rogan is?" You'd probably only still find a minority of people who would even know who you're talking about. Whereas Meghan Markle, yeah, you probably have 99 out of 100 know who she is.
Yeah, that's true. So capitalizing on a bit of that curiosity and a big household name.
It's like what they were say when you like join, like, you know, some of these former reality TV stars who join OnlyFans. And they say that, they get all these subscribers in the first, month because everyone just wants to get all the nudie pics or whatever, but they're not, like, they lose all their subscribers.
So they just have to keep on putting out more and more degrading
they have to go
pictures.
worse. Like it starts off just being like...
you got to do DVDA at my age.
Yeah. It starts off with lingerie and ends up with, things stuck in orifices and stuff.
Q-tips only, with people only talk about Q-tips.
But no, I think without getting into the content of her podcast itself, so like actually like the one the best one, I actually really like the Mariah Carey one, but because I liked Mariah Carey, not because it's like the guest brings the value. So
that's why we have no guests. We're the whole value.
We're it.
Yeah.
My negative or cynicism towards her is built off the fact that my assumption is that she's kind of figuratively and literally a princess sort of thing, right? So it's that acted in a way, a sort of an entitled way, or a way that, where the royal family, that is a very stoic sort of culture, right? And there's reports of her being abusive to staff and things like that. So there's that entitled sort of thing, and so I've got that in the back of my mind. So if you take the story at good faith and you just give her the most generous interpretation, and you go, oh yeah, actually she had a really terrible time or whatever, you could imagine having empathy for that. But she's not a very sympathetic figure, right? So because you hear all of these other things in the background, and then at the same time her own sort of, the things she says herself signals to me that those stories you hear are actually correct. So the fact that she still refers to herself as the Duchess of Sussex, that you sort of reject this thing, yet you kind of still embrace it. Like it's, and that, like they've sold all these rights to Netflix, and it just feels a little bit like a money grab. And sort of like, we don't want to be part of it, but we kind of still do because we want to make millions of dollars.
Yeah, look, let's not have this. Maybe we'll put a pin in that, because it started off as a conversation to present another side to Meghan, but now it's just become exactly the same criticism.
No, but like, you could totally shift this if those assumptions are wrong. So if my assumptions about her character, about what she's actually motivated by, are wrong, then like that pulls the pin under my whole view of her.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be bad to... it's funny, though, because usually that counter-argument to controlling the narrative of your image and kind of your story, a podcast really does that. So I guess part of the attraction of her creating this Archetypes podcast would be to tell her story, right? And to take control of her narrative again.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit disappointing that that's not how it's received from a lot of people. But on a totally different note, I think why I started off the conversation about our break and it being a bit of a pain in my ass, it has been both figuratively and literally. So for reasons I shall not get into right now, I had to go see the doctor about some kind of issues, and one thing led to another.
Did you say issues or fishes?
So one thing led to another, and she was like, well, you know, she asked me a few bunch of questions, and then she said, oh, well, can I have a look at your asshole? She was a mild-mannered Indian female doctor. I said that in a really strange order. She was a female Indian doctor, middle-aged, and I can honestly say that I have never had a inspection down there, ever. In fact, times where I thought I should have had an inspection somewhere in the groin region, it never eventuated. It was always like, oh, I don't need to see that. Just take these things.
Do you know what that reminds me of? When you have and you buy a new car and you don't have to get it inspected to renew the registration, but then when it reaches a certain
take your
age,
word for it.
You've got to get it inspected every single year.
Well, I've reached that point in my life. They need to see it. They need proof. They need proof of life. So anyway, so she's like, can I have a look? And I was really shocked, right? I wasn't prepared. But what am I going to do? I came to see her with my issue. I can't be like, oh, well, now that I'm here, no, you can't see it. It's like, it's just, I'll come back. We'll schedule an appointment. I'll prepare. So anyway,
did you get into like assume like an altered state of reality? Say, oh, I'm not me now. I'm just like the robot controlling like this
astral
body
project over my body. Just watch it being done to myself.
It's like an out of body experience.
Yeah. So anyway,
or an in a body experience.
Unfortunately, way too in my body. So she ushers me over to those horrific blue medical like benches, and she has like a big massive paper roll there that she just pulls unceremoniously across the blue thing and drapes it over there. It's like the width of the bench is probably about 1 meter, and the width of the towel that's meant to protect you from the last person who had been violated on this bench is probably about 30 centimeters. So it's like this tiny little strip in the middle of the bed. And then you get on it, and then she kind of pulls the curtain over and locks the door, which I think the lock was like, that lock was so fucking loud. It was like a shotgun. It was like, and so I'm sitting on there, and she's like, okay, just like hug your knees, pull your pants down. And she didn't leave the curtain bit for me to do that. You know how like when you go get a treatment for a massage, they always leave you there, and they're just going to take your pants off, keep your underwear on, and put the towel over. I'll come back when you're ready. And then they'll kind of ask, they'll be like, mister, are you ready? Sorry, I don't know why I did that accent. But anyway, they check on the room, and they're like, are you ready? She didn't leave. She just kind of like, I had to like do it in front of her. I'm like, what? Why is the curtain? Why is there a curtain if this is happening? Like, and you're inside the curtain. I don't understand. Like, why is there any partition in the room? Anyway, so I get over that. I find my nerves, sit on this ridiculously small paper towel on a medical blue bench, hold my knees, and then, I don't even hear the glove go on, but she's like poking around down there, and she's like whispering in my ear. Like I can feel like her hot breath on my ear as I'm bent over in like the fetal position while she's poking around, and she's like, oh, yes, yeah, relax. And it was just horrible, right? And any kind of questions about whether that would be pleasurable as a man have now been shattered. Also, how are you supposed to relax when someone's like poking around down there? It's like, impossible. So anyway, I get through that ordeal, and then she kind of finishes the business to write up her notes. As I get off the table on the bench, I look back at the paper towel, and there's all this kind of like brown stuff smeared on the bottom of the paper towel on the bench. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, she's like, I didn't know this was happening. Maybe she's been like, plucking poo out of my bum and like smearing it on the paper thing to keep on doing her exam. I'm like freaking out right now. And I'm like, oh my God, like I have to like leave this curtain room and go face her. And then I look down at my shoe, and there's like mud on my shoe, and it's actually like the mud from my shoe. I'm like, oh my God. Anyway, it was one of life's moments that was truly humbling. Thus ends the monologue on my rectal exam.
Well, so race.
Okay, so what are we talking about today?
I think we're trying to tackle one of the more controversial topics of our times.
A voyeuristic exploration down the twisting canals of society's race problem.
Yes, of race, and
a colonoscopy, if you will, on the issues of race.
It's obviously, and rightfully so, a very it's a topic that you have to speak very sensitively about because different people have a lot of history with this for
Andy, you're taking
various.
this so seriously. Like,
Well, but I think the flip side of that is like because it is such a sensitive topic for so many people, it does mean it is difficult to have an open conversation, and I think that's why it's good for us to try and tackle it, especially if we are doing so in a good faith way. So we're not,
yeah,
we're not meaning to be offensive, or we're definitely trying to be sensitive to different histories and different
traumas and
pasts and whatever else. But that said, like the fact that it is this topic that's almost like to unpack it is almost like it's too dangerous, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways that it barely gets discussed openly and in the sort of frank way that I think we will today. So
I think so.
But, yeah.
And I think the place, you're right, the place to start to have the environment we need to build around this conversation is that of friends with good intentions. And I think if we do that, we can explore and we can step over certain things that we wouldn't be able to do in your everyday conversation around race.
Yes. I think we've both prepared our whole lives for this conversation. As a white, straight male,
Why did you linger on straight?
Well, I was just trying to like draw on the fact that like I basically have no box to tick on the intersectionality front. Just on that note, like when I try and sort of think, oh, what's the thing that I've got? Like, what's the thing I can grab onto? I think, oh, I went to a public school. That's what I'll choose.
1 in a million.
That's as much hardship as I've had in my life, and it by all means was not was a very good public school at that. So even then, it would be disingenuous to make any claim. But
I think sorry, you go.
I was going to say, I guess in the context of preparing your whole life, I mean, I've obviously grown up myself in an environment where it really hasn't affected. I mean, like to be perfectly frank and honest, like it's not something that's ever I've had any direct experience with, and I guess my experience with it is probably more as someone who is ignorant to a lot of the issues that are present, such that in sort of understanding, or maybe being able to contribute. Well, what is it like to be someone who doesn't really quite get it?
Yeah.
So that's my experience as a racist. How about yours?
Yeah, it's the title of your biography, actually. My experience as a white male racist.
Just as an aside, I watched this brief documentary about Johnny Warren, the Australian footballer, and I was just watching this, so just how much times have changed. So in 2002, so this is what I learned from the documentary, that he published a book called Sheila Wogs and Poofters, an incomplete biography of Johnny Warren and soccer in Australia. And it's just like you wouldn't, you wouldn't get away with that nowadays, would you?
No. So first of all, let me respond to your intro / clumsy disclaimer. I think that you need to have a conversation in a safe place, but that goes for every single controversial topic. And I think when you have a minority having an issue in society like racism, it needs to be with the incumbent majority, right? That conversation needs to happen. And so I think that's where it's wrong. It can't just be minorities talking to themselves. And this idea that just because you are white, you're not part of that conversation. You shouldn't say anything about it. You shouldn't express your view on racism in your country. And I think that's where it kind of breaks down, right? And then when people do, it's not actually a lot of the times the minorities that go after them. It's other people from their own culture. And it becomes a little bit of this, virtue signaling situation. But I think today we're going to have a good conversation, and don't worry, Andy, you'll still be invited to the cookout by the end of it.
The cookout, I was waiting for the spring rolls to come out again.
See, it's really good. I love it. Now, when I thought about this episode, our listeners would probably already know that I'm of Asian heritage, because I've brought it up a number of times. But really, while they might have assumed that you were white, you haven't talked about your heritage at all. So it would actually be, insincere to just assume that you were just a plain vanilla Australian crumpet.
So what the listeners don't know is that I'm actually a big black dude
With a tiny penis. You break all stereotypes.
No, look,
So you're a big black sunburnt man.
Actually, and I think this is an interesting exercise because, look, so if you were to classify me according to my race, and I must admit, I do have a bit of a problem with this idea of classifying people by race anyway, as a starting point. But anyway, if you were to do that, you would call me like Caucasian, like white, right? I'm like classic white. I haven't done a
like classic Coke.
Yeah. I'm true.
Not like that vanilla Coke.
Yeah, I'm full white. On both sides of the family. I'm not aware of any
of any flavor whatsoever.
Yeah, I haven't done the ancestry, DNA thing.
I really want to do that.
I don't want to get caught for all those crimes I committed.
I know. Or any future crimes of my progeny.
That's right. Don't give your DNA away. But I have actually been thinking about my heritage. So look, my dad is English. So that's if you want to talk about the country that represses the rest of the world, English, is among the top, you don't want to come from there. But at the same time, there was no privilege in my dad's upbringing. He grew up, single mother, didn't ever meet his dad or know his dad. There was very, very tough. Post World War, rations were still a thing. Lived with
classic white man. Try to make a racism episode all about yourself.
Well, but so if we're gonna talk about this, right? It's white, but there's nothing on my dad's side that's
privileged,
lords, or this is pretty working class and probably at the lower end of working class. And then on my mum's side, it's all Irish, right? So now if you want to think of a repressed people, like Irish people, they're up there, right? Or they're certainly, I don't want to say they're up there as though there's some competition, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is a
they've
a country
known their fair share of discrimination.
Yeah, I guess they've been, the English and conquered and did all these things. So there's, maybe slavery is the thing, probably the thing that they haven't had, whereas that's obviously probably the most pernicious side of all of this. But we're talking about a country that has historically been repressed, right? Yet you look at an Irish person, and if you've got Irish blood, so to speak, but I hate that concept. But if you do have Irish heritage, your heritage is it doesn't show up, right? You can't tell that someone's Irish as opposed to an English aristocrat, right? So I think that's an interesting sort of dynamic. But that's my background.
And look, the reason I bring it up is that when you are from a racial minority, you tend to talk about it, but you've never really talked about your heritage, right? So it's just a different kind of awareness around the issue. So I was born in Australia, but both my parents are from Malaysia, and it's on the Chinese Malaysian heritage, or in that kind of that vein, right? So it's a very much an Asian culture and a Chinese kind of heritage. So I'm gonna obviously we come at this, our experiences from this due to our race, will define and color all of the conversations that we have today. So we'll kind of go a little bit back and forth, and we both haven't prepared much for this. So it's going to be actually a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to it because we actually haven't spoken about this a lot as a topic. I don't really know why, because, off air, we talk about everything and anything throughout, our friendship together, but we haven't really spoken about race at all. And that maybe that's a bit telling as well around, our view on it or whatever it is, or kind of, and sometimes I think maybe acceptance is molded into that too, of not calling out differences. But let me ask you a few questions just to get us going, okay? So I've got a question for you. Does racism still exist in Australia? And how would you define it?
I think maybe just start with defining racism. I think this is where there's a lot of different, and I think it's actually changed over time. Like, so I think if you said to my parents, like, I think my parents' generation would, baby boomers that is, would understand racism as like Ku Klux Klan sort of thing, right? And they probably wouldn't see sort of more subtle forms of racist like in that way. They would like of racism in that way. They would probably see it as literally you hate someone because they're of a different race. And I guess over time, and I think increasingly, we've started to incorporate broader definitions. As it's not just like a hate sort of thing. It's not just that you dislike or hate that about someone because they're of a different race. And we've moved to a more generic definition or agnostic definition to say, well, it doesn't matter for what the reason is that you treat someone differently because of their race. What matters is that if the experience of someone because of their race is different, then that itself is inherently like a racist thing. So there might not even be negative intentions. It could just be that someone, for example, looks at someone and says, "Oh, you know, they've got an interesting background. They look a bit different. They're wearing cultural clothes. Let's let's invite them to be part of the culture club because we want to learn more about that." And so there might be even goodwill or some good positive intention behind that, but actually the fact that you're singling out someone and treating them in that way is potentially has this sort of racist part of it. So I think to the question of do we have racists in Australia or is racism a thing within Australia, I think that question is highly contextual on what your definition is. So I think if it is more the Ku Klux Klan-esque definition, then I think we've definitely moved on from in the past when we would have looked at, let's say, Indigenous Australians and said, "Oh, they're inferior," they're a different species, or like that kind of stuff, right? We've moved on from that time, and we're very open, and we're almost proud of the fact that we're open to different cultures and different ethnic and racial backgrounds or whatever. But I think it's clear that we're not yet completely alert to the subtle, more granular things that probably characterize the experience of people who aren't within that majority group.
Yeah. So maybe let me kind of try to triangulate it from a different approach. Where would you see racism at its worst in Australian culture at the moment?
I think in communities and sections of society that are not exposed to people from a different background.
So the kind of ignorance and the exposure aspect.
So, like, I mean, I'll maybe just to illustrate kind of a point, if you live in sort of inner city, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, whatever, you're very familiar with lots of different backgrounds, and you kind of, there's probably two things that happen. One is there's nothing novel about seeing someone that looks a bit different to you or that eats different food to you or whatever. There's nothing novel about that. It's not unusual, and you probably even enjoy it. You enjoy the vibrancy of it, and you grow to kind of enjoy the differences rather than see anything negative about it. But the further away you move from that kind of epicenter, you get people who, and it's not just geography. Geography is probably part of it, but it's also like social, like the way we're stratified socially too. So, I mean, like there's people that I know from like growing up who, have become tradespeople, for example. And I listen, I still hear the way they talk and I think, holy fuck, I hear certain words or certain sentences uttered and I think, oh God, it's so jarring to me.
Yeah.
Based on my sensibilities. But it's like the fact that this person could say this means that in their world, on a building site or whatever, it's normal, it's accepted, it's part of the culture.
And it doesn't take much to go backwards. If you think about what we've been saying, where certain words back in the day would have been accepted, but now they're not. if you go back and you transplant those circles into, say, like, not to generalize, but say tradie culture or something like that on the work site where perhaps things are a bit looser, it wouldn't take long for that to creep back in if people weren't holding ground on correcting that language every time it happens. I really don't think it would.
I don't think there's anything intrinsic that's like the natural state to use that language. I think it's just that the dominant culture is just still so dominant in that, like, whatever those settings are, that it's almost like going back in time, right? But to the extent that, like, Australia or, and like the world is becoming increasingly multi-ethnic, it doesn't matter where you sit in the world. Yeah, I can't see us like reverting back to kind of 1950s sort of attitudes.
Yeah, it's a funny one. So we'll have a bit of back and forth in a second, but I guess the final question I kind of throw at you in this headline space around racism in Australia, do you think that people from other countries would characterize Australia as being racist?
So I think Australia is a country that has to grapple with issues of race more than other countries have tended to, because we are multicultural. We do have a high proportion of people born overseas. We do have communities, waves of immigrants from communities and cultures which are quite different to the dominant culture. So if, for example, you hear or you read an article saying this unambiguously racist event happened here in Australia, and therefore Australia must be a racist country, then part of that is because there are more, like, there's a higher volume of instances that kind of stuff can arise. Whereas
because we're more multicultural, is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like if you go to Japan, for example, there are far fewer ways that race can crop up because there isn't the diversity in a place like Japan. But like when you actually like unpack, like, for example, Japanese attitudes to outsiders, they're actually much more racist than Australia. Like, absolutely. Like there's no, basically the view is that, there's like the superior people and they're Japanese and everyone else is like, barbarian, basically.
Again, I think it comes back to definitions, right? Around whether you think any kind of discrimination is racism, or the more hardcore version where there are actually acts of violence against people of another race, purely because due to their race. And I think those are to be clear, they're both forms of racism. But I think that the ones that make the news headlines are the ones that involve some kind of attack, some kind of race-related crime or assault that happens. And those are the ones that typically make the headlines, right?
Yeah. I mean,
so in Australia, we've had issues around attacks on international Indian students and same with international Chinese students. We had the famous Cronulla riots that we had that was between, Australian, white Australians and kind of Lebanese Australians, I suppose. So all these things, I think, have culminated in creating a bit of an image for Australia that we have a problem with race.
So to be clear, I do think, we could do better.
You're on your
way. I think at the end of the day, all countries that have, have their baggage, right?
Baggage holders or movers, is that? Because they're usually brown. It's been really interesting for me growing up as a the first, well, I guess the second generation Australian. So my parents migrated from Malaysia, and I've kind of grown up here and had to find my way, having parents that had no idea what it was like growing up in Australia, and me going through the school that we went to, which was predominantly a white middle class school. And so I think that I've had to find my way culturally and how I run that connection through from my level of assimilation and my journey around Australian culture versus the heritage and the cultural norms that I've inherited from my family and my greater Chinese community. I've been really curious about that journey and how to sew that thread, because I think what happens when you are born in Australia for the first generation is that you're really misplaced. And a lot of people have spoken about this immigrant experience and this idea of becoming Australian. And a really good way to sum it up is that a lot of my Australian friends think of me as Chinese, but my Chinese community think of me as Australian. So you're kind of caught in between, right? And I think that that is a very alienating place to be sometimes. And there are obvious social pressures for you to assimilate and adopt Australian culture, because when you don't, you are discriminated against, whether that is racial or whatever it is that happens, especially growing up and the pressures of school. So sometimes you don't know what you give up until it's too late, and you find yourself really stranded without a home. I've been really interested in my journey and talking to others, and I've only just, now that I'm older, started thinking about all of my extended family and their experience, and I've been actually talking to them and talking about their journeys leaving their countries and coming to Australia, or some have gone to the States and other things like that, or some have gone to the UK, and asking them what it's been like kind of transitioning the cultures and the racism that they experience. And I think it's no surprise to anyone here that older generations experience more overt racism. I have memories as young as 5-6 years old of seeing racism play out before my eyes against my parents. And it wasn't too long till I experienced it directly. And I think one of the first times I ever experienced it, that I can remember anyway, was from a teacher when I was in year 3. And this was just a normal kind of like Caucasian female teacher in year 3 in fairly middle-class suburb. And she was frustrated with me for some reason, and she pulled me aside and said, why, she said a version of, and I've always remembered this, she said, "You Chinese kids tend to have good grades, but you're just no good. You can't follow the rules." That's what she said to me when I was in grade 3. And what's grade 3? You must be about, what, 7 or 8?
Yeah.
So I experienced it pretty early on, which is pretty incredible, right? And I think back then teachers had more balls as well. They saw probably nothing wrong with like speaking to a child in that way. And I think that kind of level of authoritarianism has reduced as teachers have been kind of pulled into line as well.
How did you place that, like, as a child? Like, you obviously remember it. I mean, it's the first thing that you mention. How did you place that at the time? Like, did you take it on board, or did you did you internalize it? Oh yeah, the teacher said this, so I have to remember this thing, or did you did you see it for what it was at the time, which was basically like racist kind of bullshit, right?
It was a bit of a disbelief at the time, and I think it's what I was trying to talk to you about earlier, where I was born in Australia, living in a very Caucasian suburb, like close to where we grew up. All my friends are white, except for my Chinese community friends and my family and relatives. So I didn't necessarily think about my Chinese otherness on a day-to-day basis. So when you hit those moments, it's like slamming into a brick wall at speed. And then you go, oh, okay, this is why this teacher doesn't like me, or is picking on me, or whatever it may be, right? And I think at that time, like, even at that age, I remember myself being very defiant in it. I was like, I was angry. I like went home and spoke to my parents about it, and I knew at a deep level she was wrong, but then you kind of thrust against this situation where that's your teacher. That your teacher's telling you, looking into the eyes of one of their students, only 7 or 8 years old, saying, "You people, you're no good." Like, I think, and just to kind of know that there's probably nothing you can do to change that. And this person is responsible for you. And in primary school, it's not like you can just have a subject with a teacher and then you move on. She's there for the whole year. So I remember being very angry about it. I remember talking to my parents about it. And of course, nothing happened. I got through my year and moved on. And, I think about her a lot, and all the other kids she probably gave that same experienced to and what kind of little scars and how that may have changed them. I see myself as a very strong person even back then, but who knows? And what kind of scars it's left on me versus people who are more vulnerable as well. So that's me, right? And that's at a very, very young age. And so that, to me, coming back to it, that's a relative, someone saying something to you, right? And she would have looked at that at the time she said it, and she's like, well, I didn't call him a chink. I didn't, like nothing. I'm just kind of, I'm his teacher. I'm allowed to comment on his character. And she probably didn't even think it was that bad. Going back to one of my first times I witnessed it even earlier with my dad, actually. I remember one time we were coming through customs from Malaysia into Australia, and it's common for Chinese people to bring back a lot of sweets and cookies and pastries because you can't get them in Australia, especially at that time. And so we're lining up to go through customs, and of course you have to declare all the food, which we did. And so we're lining there, and we were presented with this kind of big burly customs officer, and he was grilling my dad over this stuff, and he was complying, show me this, what is that, what is this? And he said some derogatory remark about the food, and he's like, how can you eat this crap? And then he picked up these kind of fine biscuits that were from this town in Malaysia, and he kind of said, what's in this? And my dad just said, cookie ingredients, and began to say, sugar and wheat and all this kind of stuff. And he goes, I need to check for banned substances. And he just, through the plastic bag, he pushed with his fingers until he mushed every single cookie and then handed it back to my dad to move through. He says, fine, move on. And that's one of my earliest memories. So I'm contrasting those experiences to some of the racism I see today versus how overt. Like, I think you can agree that those stories are the very definition of racism when you hear that, right? Beyond like actually, physically assaulting someone. It doesn't get much worse than that. And I will say that talking to my relatives and stuff, they're littered with stories like that, where I think that it really makes me wonder, a secondary question, which is probably even more important, is why? Why did that customs officer do that? Why did my teacher do that? And I have to believe something was taught to them, passed to them. And then where does that cycle or that chain of discrimination or hate or whatever it is, otherness, come from? And I guess that's one of the questions I'm still grappling with. I think it's similar to any kind of indoctrination. And I think it starts at schools. So one of the questions I asked, where you think racism still is strong and where it exists. Yeah, I think there's places where there's ignorance or when cultures clash, because like you said, say in Cabramatta, like a big Vietnamese population expanded in a relatively short amount of time and then displaced the white population. Of course, you're going to have some clashes in the cultural differences. But I have to believe that a lot of it exists at the start with schools. So it's a breeding ground for that kind of behavior where you're testing things. And if they're not corrected by the time you work your way through school, you solidify that in adulthood and then you pass that on in a more serious way. So I think the battleground is actually in schools.
I mean, I think to begin with, 30 years ago, the world was quite different, right?
Well, but before you go into that, though, are you surprised to hear those stories?
To be honest, no. I'd like to say I was, but I guess maybe there's some incompleteness to this conversation, but if you told me that, okay, so we're having a conversation about race and those are the stories that, now there's other stories.
No, we'll get to those.
Yeah. Well, so these are the characterization of the stories, and we're talking about incidents that, well, I hope happened, more than 20 years ago. I don't know if I'm absolutely sure that there's been things more contemporary as well. But if I cast my mind back to what was 20 years ago, like in Australia, and that's the experience. I mean, the Cronulla riots is a perfect example. I mean, that was less than 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
The time was quite different. And I mean, I guess what I wanted to say was that you mentioned schools. I actually think it's not schools. I actually think it's families and households. And this is probably why I think you could be more optimistic about the future because, I mean, I grew up in, like my household was like, I wouldn't say I necessarily had any enabling experiences, but I did, like I have, been with friends, households, and I have been in circumstances where I've heard parents of my friends talk in a way that empowers or enables children to have, like, because you mentioned it's like passing it on, like someone has to give them that thing. And I have seen that like firsthand where like the adults pass on their views and their prejudice.
Open the door to it, right?
And it just makes it like if you're hearing that as a kid, the first thing is like, well, that's normal to have that view. So, and I guess, I think just what's the motivate, like you mentioned, well, what's the motivation for the thing that you mentioned? Like, so that whole thing, like, why would you be a fucking asshole and, ruin something just because you can, right? I think it comes down to, a view that like, I think that the critical thing that needs to exist for like these racist actions or like things to be spoken, actions to be done, is the view that these other people are not the same as me. So like that there's no common ground, right? And the moment you view people as other people rather than, oh, we're just the same people, but we're just, we've got our own sort of slight differences and cultural differences or whatever, that destroys all empathy. So the moment you can have empathy for another person that's different to you is the moment you will not do those things. But if you see the like other groups as sufficiently different to you, then empathy is severed. And then when it comes to viewing, let's say, like the wave of like Asian immigration that we had in Australia, sort of, I don't know, probably from the 70s onwards, if your viewpoint is that these are just, these are just like these people coming in and like swarming our neighborhoods or whatever, then you can have that, like people can form that like negative view of the world because, they're coming in and they're changing our suburbs and whereas I think now, and this is why I hope we can be more optimistic, is that it sort of happened as in, you go to parts of Sydney and they're vibrant, they're completely different, right, to what they would have been in the 50s. And people love it for it, right? People like even white people, inverted commas, love going to places that look and feel different because it's like part of the vibrancy of it. So the attitudes have now changed from being one of like fear and being unable to empathize with new like people coming into Australia to one of being actually we work with people who look different to us and we know that they're actually very normal people. They're like us. They're they're interested in the same things as us. They're first generation, second generation Australians even born here. Like they are us. There's no difference between them and us. And so we can have empathy and those bridges of empathy get built.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that in-group, out-group mentality is driving a lot of that. And then race obviously plays into that because if you know nothing about someone, you judge them by what you see. And what you see on the outside, obviously, race plays a big part in that. So it naturally gravitates to that. And that's happening all over the place in schools, right? So I think that's why I bring that up.
So I don't know if this is a good example or not. It's probably not a good example, but I'll give it anyway. I looked in my letterbox today, and inside my letterbox, I saw lots of snails eating. It was junk mail, so it didn't bother me, right? But just like 30 snails, right? Over the top. Now, I'm not for a second comparing immigrants to snails.
Where did all these snails come from? Who let them in? My box.
But I took every one of those snails and I fucking chucked them on the road, right? As far as I could throw them. It's half fucking snails, right?
You learned that from your dad, man.
Now,
watching him as a child, just like crushing these snails.
I didn't actually want to step on them because I didn't want to get the mushiness on my shoes. But I guess the reason I raise this example now is because if you perceive an immigrant or someone traveling to Australia from another, faraway land to so different from you that they're nothing like you, much like I saw the snail and I was like very happy to throw it away. I know it would probably shrivel away and die. That's in some ways what's going on here. Now it's obviously less extreme than that but there is the thing that's kind of, if I felt like that the snail was a person, was a human being that was like me, that of course I would not throw the snail on I'd probably say, oh, here you go, I'll even build you a nice home so you don't need to live in my letterbox or whatever, right? And I guess what I'm trying to draw out with this, as awkward as an example as it is that perhaps that big burly guy that was at customs however many years ago, maybe not snails, but maybe in his mind, these people coming from a faraway land are not quite like me, and I can kind of treat them like animals, or I can kind of treat them differently to how I would treat Europeans that come through, right? And that's what explains that behavior. And hopefully there was less difference in that person's respect for your dad than there was with me to a bunch of snails. But I guess, hopefully over time, and it's that melting pot thing where people become more familiar and start to empathize more.
Yeah, I don't know if someone like that changes, to be honest. There's one of the questions I've been mulling over, if you are someone who has had that kind of thought and behavior inside you, can you really reform? And I guess that's one of the questions that I've been mulling over. And look, maybe he was right in the end because, maybe all the Chinese people did come and take his jobs because you don't see many white people working in customs anymore. So maybe he was right. He was onto something. But let's go to that kind of redemption thing, right? So I'll weave in another story. So let's fast forward to high school. Now, day-to-day high school, we went to the same high school. So for our listeners, still predominantly a kind of Caucasian mix of people, but definitely some cultures thrown in there. Now, would you have expected, well, first of all, did you witness any racist acts at high school?
Just coming back to definitionally, I think absolutely there would have been things that we understand today to be racist. There absolutely would have been things that would have happened. And I think I would have even been a perpetrator. But that's with a contemporary definition. I think, and when I say I'd be a perpetrator, that sounds horrible, but I think I'm thinking of more ignorance, like where you don't quite really understand.
Give some color to this.
Well, I guess, for example, and I think I've said to you before, I just see you as you're just like Australian. Like I don't even see you as any different to any, as though there's some, like the implication of that is that there's something wrong with not being
not one of those filthy Asians.
Yeah,
you're in the club.
Yeah. So like a comment like that, for example, or I remember, and I would have said that too. Like I had a really good mate when I was at high school. He didn't actually go to our high school, but he was a good mate during high school, and was of Indian, he was second generation Indian. So his parents moved over to Australia, and he was born here. I think he was born here, or he certainly grew up here. If he wasn't born here, and he, I think I probably if I went back and I thought, when you're young, you've got to give a little bit of leeway, right? But if you took the very worst of the things that I would have said to him, I would have done the accent. I would have spoken in Indian accents and almost to but jokingly or whatever. But to me that was just, there's nothing wrong with that. That's it's all just a little bit of bagging out your mates, a little bit like you would do, with maybe just a different thing you'd be bagging another mate out on, but just something else, right? And it was all in good humor and good jest, and of course, it was a good mate. It was absolutely well intentioned, other than the fact that it was ignorance, right? So,
Well, it
And
probably goes back to like my comment earlier, right? Like, was there ever a time where he was offended by that, or he had to act like he wasn't, kind of thing? That's the grey area, isn't it?
Well, he may have been offended, but he he didn't like it's. And of course, like one of the weird things that happened is like he went through a period, and I don't know if this is something that you could relate to, but when, during high school, most of his friends, or at least, well, maybe towards the end, I'm not sure, but like certainly for a large chunk of his experience at high school, he had mates who were, quote unquote Aussie, like white Aussie sort of, and, wasn't really into his Indian heritage or culture. And then and then at uni, like he got all full into it.
Yeah.
And that was actually a bit alienating for me, because it's like, he was probably like my, I'll probably say probably my well, certainly my mate who I would spent the most time with, growing up at high school. And we would just kick around, do things, we just had a lot of common interests, right? And like everything was geared up for us to just spend a lot of time together. And so we spent a lot of time together. And it actually then, like when we got to uni, like we were still friends or whatever, but it was quite alienating for me because we were doing our thing, and then going out and all that. And in my mind, I was like, oh yeah, we'll do all this together. But then he was getting really into like his Indian heritage, and this like, and there's a whole subculture to all of that I couldn't relate to. I wasn't part of that. So, and then that was almost where we kind of went a little bit our separate ways.
But that's a tough thing, and especially exacerbated by male relationships. Let's be honest, right? I think that for anyone who kind of questions what it's like for, having male relationships growing up as teenagers or younger boys, you need to do yourself a favor and watch an episode of The Inbetweeners, because that's kind of how it is, right? Like, I think that there's always this kind of ripping on each other and kind of this play. That's kind of our version of play fighting. And I think in male friendships, when you're young and you're a teenager, everything's fair game and everyone's making fun of everyone. There is a level of aggression in terms of how people talk to each other and how they go after each other for laughs and for things like that. And I think that's where that exacerbates the problem of racist dialogue, because as a man, you're already kind of trying, as a young man, you're trying to actually not you're trying to go with it, right? You're not trying to kind of call people out or be overly sensitive, because that in itself creates more cannon fodder for your mates to double down on. So you're just trying to kind of get by in this kind of gym locker environment. And in some ways, is it going to really help you to call people out on certain language, right? It's like, oh, no, you can't refer to me like that. This is, you said something slightly racist to me, it would be directly before or after talking about like fucking my mum or something. Like this is the level, the quality of language that a young man probably has to deal with in a lot of their relationships. And this is not necessarily, the end of the spectrum of people. It's just a part of the culture of growing up and kind of the way people talk. So I think that's the hard bit, right? And you're not knowing, right?
And I think, like, to be more generous to like my younger self and other younger selves who would have a similar experience, if you judged what the kinds of things that would be said 25 years ago against the rules of today and the sensibilities of today, like, you're basically saying, well, you should have known that was like a horrible thing to say. And the fact that you said it meant that you obviously had bad intentions and you're obviously a horrible person. Whereas the reality was that at that time, the things that were said because they were within the rules, within the boundaries. And they were never meant with an ill will.
You never went it with an ill will.
I never did. And I think a lot of people in this similar situation never. Now, the examples you gave are quite different to the ones that I'm talking about. I'm talking about where you have just like, oh, you just think whatever the thing is that you can do to have a laugh or whatever, right? Make like, yeah, it's a bit like when, growing up, it was totally acceptable for every second utterance to be, oh, that's gay, right? Growing up.
Mm.
I don't know if you remember that, but like, oh, that's
Don't know what
gay.
you're talking
Oh, how
about.
gay is that thing? Now, if you said that today, you would be rightfully pulled up. But like at the same time, gay was just a substitute for like bad or lame or some other, and like it wasn't a conscious thing in the minds of children growing up that would say that's gay. That like that homophobia wasn't embedded necessarily in that statement. It was just that was the word that people used back then growing up. And it's similar in these situations where I think the younger person 25 years ago might have said, well, might have drawn on something that is actually race related. The intention was not to kind of put someone down. In fact, the fact that you would do that, say that to someone, is almost part of the blooding experience that you're equals, right? Because you would expect them to say something back to you, like of equal, but it's just a different thing that relates to you. So it's just, so I guess it's the intention thing, and it's the fact that was maybe more tolerated back then because we weren't as kind of alert to these things. Means that you've got to kind of judge it in the context of the time.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, and I think I
Okay, so
agree with your
can I just
sentiment.
ask you a question about that, right? Sorry to interrupt you, but like I've just said, like the person saying it doesn't mean it. But if, growing up when you would hear someone like, let's say they'd call you, like just hypothetically, oh, you chink, but it's all in jest, right? And you know that they're kind of talking to you as a peer, would you be offended by that? Or like at the time, well, like, sorry, not now you would. If anyone called you that now, you rightfully very much should be. But back in the day, like, how did you feel about that?
Yeah, and it's really hard because when you're saying that, I'm hanging off every word you're saying to kind of determine the level that I'm okay with and where my boundaries are, right? So let's be a bit more specific, right? Just to kind of help the listeners contextualize like what it is, right? So if someone was to say to me and call me a chink or something like that, right? Or ching chong or something like that. To me, that would have never been acceptable and would be kind of an act of aggression, right? So if it was a friend, if it was a deep friend, we'd either be kind of having it out there or we wouldn't be friends. So again, it's about the boundaries that you put in, right? So if I go further back, this is a really good example because I just spoke to my auntie actually about her experiences when she first came to Australia in the 80s. And she was saying there that people were calling her ching chong all the time. And I think I actually shared the clip with you where she kind of said, well, they weren't saying it in a bad way. They were saying like, hey, ching chong, kind of thing, like without any kind of aggression or intent. But to me, being calling someone a ching chong or a chink or slanting your eyes or something is a very, very clear racial slur.
No, probably even when we were growing up, it would have been, or at high school, that I can imagine.
Yeah, so I want to kind of take that as an example, right? So that boundary was set for me, and I think the difference a little bit is the power dynamic. So when my auntie came to Australia in the 80s, it was just there was no power for her to make a big deal and push back on that. By the time we were in high school, I felt more than empowered to have that confrontation due to my circumstance and who I was and my mental state and my kind of self-esteem. I could do that. But I can imagine if people are in different circumstances and they really needed that friend or they really needed to fit in, there's no limit to what they might endure. So yeah, look, that specific word, absolutely outside my boundaries. And I actually do remember. So one of memories, we were playing on the sporting field, and someone we went to school with called me a chink, and we had like almost a fight about it, a physical fight. And won't name names, but I'm reflecting on that experience. We kind of like pushed each other, and we kind of got broken up. And you talk about taking things in context. To me, that was a clearly racial slur. It was done a totally different circumstance to what we're talking about because it was an act of aggression and it ended up in a fight. It wasn't, we're being friends. He used it in a derogatory manner kind of thing. And I kind of want to, going back to my original question, how much forgiveness and how much hope for, how much should he have to carry that around with him, you know, and his responsibility for how that made me feel and what that said about him and what was inside him, you know. He's gone on to live a normal life, and I don't know him now, but how should I guess my question is, how should I feel about him and his capacity for his childhood transgressions?
I do look back at growing up and I think, it was just such a different time to now, that it is better to give, like, for everyone's sake, including our own sake, and I say our because these things aren't just like in your case it was related to race, but equally, you know, like there's lots of really terrible things that get said in the playground any given day, right? And it might not be as cutting as like a racial slur, but
yeah,
you know, like, but in whatever given reason, there'll be someone who will want to say something to try and rile someone up and offend them, and they're just going to choose whatever the thing is, right? Whether it's race related, whether it's calling someone a poofda, whether it's whatever it might be, right? That I think in the context of the schoolyard, especially the schoolyard, you know, 20 odd years ago, it is helpful to everyone to give everyone the benefit of the doubt as much as possible, just because when you're a fucking 13, 14-year-old kid, you don't know what the fuck you're doing. Like you're naive, you don't understand the power and impact of your words. And you as an adult are really essentially a completely different person. And I think it's empowering from both. It's obviously beneficial to give that the actual person, like to the person, that the benefit of the doubt, it's beneficial to them. But it's also, I think, empowering as the adult who it's happened to kind of, it's empowering to be able to say, to the extent that happened, that's on them. That's actually, that reflects poorly on them. And to actually be able to say that, well, if they still think that way, then I feel even more sorry for them, right?
Can you see how, and I totally agree with you, right? And but can you see how people, minorities that have had instances in their life where they've been forced to deal with racism or some kind of discrimination, they become angry or bitter because every solution to the problem is always the high road, right? It never feels like justice is served. And I totally agree with what you're saying, that, you know, no one's perfect, and there are a lot of things that happen in childhood and as you're growing up and even in adulthood, let's be honest, that you'd like to kind of improve from. But there are some things, and you can get a window into if this is happening at moments in your life, and we're talking about relatively mild examples of verbal assaults and things like that here, but the spectrum goes wide. You can see how, you know, people that have this transgression against them become bitter and angry, and they carry that with them, you know, and the damage is actually really there.
Have you been following this latest thing where this 80-something-year-old affiliated, I don't know exactly what the relationship, but affiliated with the royal family, met, I guess, someone with Caribbean heritage, but is very much a British citizen, and asked the question, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Where are your people from? and push that envelope. Like, have you followed that?
I haven't
one?
actually, no.
So
what are they saying, that is that's irresponsible or something? Or
well, she's lost all her, whatever her role was, she's lost. But I guess the reason I raised it though is, and certainly you mentioned the teacher, right? So I don't know how old that teacher was at the time, but you know, year 3, I mean, that would have been, you know, what, 20, well, more than 20, 25, 30 years ago. 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So let's say she was 40 at that time. So she'd be 70 now, right? And this particular person that said this to this guest at some royal reception is in her 80s, right? And I think so much of this tone deafness is born out of like age,
A generational thing.
Can I just take this a little bit in a different direction? So one of the things that I like, what's the solution to all of this, right? So in my mind, and I've heard this quote from Sam Harris, which I don't know, I assume it's original to him, but whether he hasn't stolen it from somewhere else. But he says, like, don't we want to get to a world where your race or the way you look in an ethnic sense is as unremarkable about a person as the color of your hair is today? As in, it's just not a thing.
Tell that to the redhead.
Well, okay.
Or the blue-haired liberal.
As close as possible
to be more contemporary.
Being unremarkable. Isn't the goal that we're trying to get to one where it's just not a factor that we even talk about? And yet at the same time, so that's my instincts, right? The way to solve this problem of race and racial discrimination is for it just not to even be an issue that registers in our consciousness. Yet at the same time, we have, and especially as we go through the conversations about past racial injustices and things like that, well, it seems like there's actually a different view that actually, no, we need to build identities around race. Like we need to, it's not about breaking down and that there is no sort of racial grouping at all. And we don't even look at it as a way to group people. It seems to be there's this other view that no, we celebrate our race and we celebrate our heritage and we identify as someone of that race.
Yeah. I mean, you expressed that pretty well. Let me jump in. I think this is not common to just race, but a lot of kind of identity and value-based things, right? So I'm not sure whether it's come from Sam Harris or whatever it is, but there is something out there. I've heard it said by a few people, and they say, "Well, what's the answer to racism? Like, what do we do?" And a lot of people say, "You just stop fucking talking about it." Right? If you no longer, as a version of that argument, if you no longer talk about a Chinese person or Mexican person or an English person, you just deal with Roger, you deal with Andy, you deal with the individual, then that gets rid of racism because you stop discussing it, and everyone's just humans, right? And you don't see that. I think that's slightly more nuanced than what you're saying about there is everything that's unremarkable. But I do believe that is not what people want. They do not want the conversation silenced. In fact, kids want to talk about it at school, and it's the teachers that don't want to talk about it. They don't want the conversation silenced, and they don't want to be erased. They want, I feel, more the latter, where your differences are acknowledged and celebrated, but there's not systemic racism and discrimination because of your background. And I think that's what people want. And I know that, speaking to some of my colleagues who were gay, that's kind of what they want too. They're like, I'm sick of this, people just trying to, it's like that thing that we were talking about earlier where you're like, oh, and it's not just you, lots of people have done it. It's a very common experience for Australian-born Chinese. I don't even think of you as Chinese. I think of you as Australian, It's your way, it's their way of kind of saying, you're in, I accept you, right? There's no difference between us. But it's kind of erasing the culture. And I think as people go on in their life, they want to celebrate their heritage even more. And that's what everyone wants, right? I think, Caucasians, or just white people, let's just call them white people, love cultures more than anyone. They love multiculturalism. They kind of have embraced it more than any other culture. You look at a modern white person's diet, It's way more diverse than the ethnic minorities that their counterparts, right? My family would never eat the wide variety that like a modern kind of Western person would. So I think it's people don't want it to be erased. They want the latter. They want the differences to be celebrated, but they don't want the discrimination that comes with that. The negative discrimination that comes with that.
I think where I think that falls down a little bit though is whilst people who inherently have or they have a connection to a culture, right? It's a different way of living or whatever. So it's not like saying, oh, well, we all just become this same monoculture and we're all the same and there's no different, and we'll just destroy cultural heritages, and then that's the best place to be. So I think where this falls down or where this becomes a bit more challenging is where people, no longer have a connection to the direct features of the historical culture related to, their sort of racial makeup from a genetic perspective. So, for example, mentioned before, I do have Irish heritage, but there's nothing about me. There's nothing about me that's Irish.
Yeah.
Just because I have some genetic material that comes from the Irish, the island of, Ireland.
There's a little bit of Irish in all of us, Andrew. Well, except for the Chinese.
Yes.
Everyone else.
There's nothing about that resonates with me today. And I do not on board the grievances of the history of repression in Ireland. And I think over time, and I think that serves me very well that I don't
take down that IRA poster.
So I guess what I'm concerned about is this sort of this race to kind of embody some sort of historically kind of aggrieved grouping of peoples who we are going to identify with because we have some long distant relative that, I don't think that's healthy for society. I think it's healthy for us to say, no, well, actually, no one's going to treat you differently.
Yeah.
And it's actually, you're kind of co-opting other people's discrimination for yourself. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think that's actually quite, and it seems to have been this thing that's happened in recent years that you see more of.
Yeah, I agree. I'll give you another example just of kind of something that you've made me think about. So while I did say that that's people's rosy idea of how to tackle this racism, celebrate everyone's culture and how wonderful it is and all live in harmony in this multicultural experiment, right? What they really think is like, oh, I thought you were just going to add falafel to the brunch menu. I didn't think you're going to bring in Sharia law and for me to have to respect that. And I think that's why, on the example of Muslims and Islamic culture compared to Judeo-Christian culture and their values, there's a real kind of impact there, I think. Or even the more secular, I suppose, values of Australia, because to truly celebrate some of these different cultures is impossible because you can't, some of them have really different values and legal values. And I think that's where, for me, it breaks down as well, right? So can you sit over there and respect a really hardcore Sharia law that doesn't let women walk around the streets unaccompanied by a man, right? Is that part of is that part of this experiment too?
Well, I guess I would say is that, are we, in the context of race, is it racist to say, no, I objectively think that this practice that I actually think is objectively repressive and bad.
Exactly.
Is that a racist thing? And I think we should, this is this moral relativism for, this idea that, oh, no, there's no such thing as a good way of living and a bad way of living. There's just different ways of living and they're all relative and it's all fine and everyone just, actually, no, you can say, if you're going to chop the hands off people because they, look at someone the wrong way, that's bad. That is bad.
And that's why I think if we switch away from, my experience and kind of Chinese and culture and that kind of things into something more extreme like that, you have a little bit of room in the conversation to actually get out there, right? Not all cultural practices can be incorporated in a new country that needs a shared base, right? And I kind of
Can I ask
acknowledge
you
that.
can I ask you a controversial question?
Yeah, I told you that I had a rectal exam, so yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that we hear now is that, like, increasingly when we look at different racial groups and their status or their outcomes in society, the one group or racial group that is performing the best and getting the best outcomes increasingly in Western countries, but even when you look at even in the homeland sort of thing, is actually Asian cultures, like Asian people of Asian heritage in just about everywhere in the world are kicking goals, are overtaking even and outperforming. So, like, how do you feel about that, and how do you think that plays in?
Yeah, look, I
So,
think that
what I'm saying is, like, are Asians the new white people?
you get a little bit of tan more than me, and all of a sudden I'm the white guy. Look, I think that it's part of the values, and I've grappled with this myself around where it comes from in terms of Asian culture and their attitudes towards competition on academia and their work ethic and the way that they essentially tiger parenting, right? The way in which they raise their kids to compete. Whether that comes from a situation where you have to compete to survive in the countries and cultures they're from, or it's just a little bit more of a general cultural piece, I'm not sure. But I know that definitely in my experience and kind of my Chinese community and people I know, the Chinese cultures tend to place that emphasis, and that kind of permeates everything that person will do in society, right? Now, going back to it though, how is it that this is happening, but yet they're so underrepresented in their host countries? It's because they kind of have to have that avenue to compete, right? Because they don't have the same networks. They don't have the same. They're facing discrimination, things like the bamboo ceiling and all this kind of stuff. I feel like they're pushed to be enterprising and to try to find the competitive advantage wherever they can, because they are in new countries and have to adapt to discriminations and systems that weren't made for them. And that's why you see so many, and that's why you see so many kind of entrepreneurs in all these countries, because they had to do that. They couldn't get jobs at companies, so they had to go and set up their own businesses. So I think it's kind of a symptom of the fact that they're in new countries and facing discrimination.
Mm. Another sort of thing that I've seen recently is I saw this social media post saying it's not enough just to not be racist. You now have to be anti-racist.
That is to some degree true, isn't it? Not just about racism, but about a lot of social things. Like you can't no longer be like on the fence about LGBT. You have to be an advocate. You have to be a champion,
Yeah.
And to a degree, I kind of understand that. Like I think it's a good thing when, not to place other people's views, right? But at the same time, support anyone who's undergoing discrimination.
The only problem is I don't think that's the goal. If by definition you're not racist, like you've got no debts, right? By definition, in this space, this whole concept of being anti-racist just opens up this massive can of worms.
Okay, let me ask you this though, right? You're not racist, but something racist goes down in front of you and you do nothing. What's that grey area?
Yeah, but
like
I don't think that's what they mean. I think what they mean is...
But that's being an advocate, right? Being a champion. Like
yeah,
if you see something, speak up and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
but I think I would incorporate that into the context of like if you just basically, if you're happy to just let a racist attack go by,
I'm not talking about something more subtle though. Like say there's a discriminatory practice in maybe a hiring thing or some kind of a bit of a softer landing than seeing someone literally attack an Asian woman on the train, right? Like, or even like something that is insensitive, speaking up in a group kind of thing. Like I think that's different. You're not a racist, but you haven't necessarily used some of your social capital, your career capital to address something that you've seen that's discriminatory.
Yeah, but I think, again, I still think those things are within the purview of, are you racist or not racist? Like, you would know that these things are wrong, but not only are they wrong, but like that's in the context of, say, a hiring practice, that's actually going to give you suboptimal outcomes, because that's not, like, by definition, you're throwing a criteria that is irrelevant to the performance in the job. But I guess what I think's happening now, the way I feel about it a little bit, is that, the rules of the game are changing, right? So it's like, well, we've kind of addressed, not perfectly, but to a large extent, many of the things that, like, the examples you've given, the reason they resonate now as such, like, oh, that's like, that's abhorrent, is because we now have come to, as a society, a point where those sorts of things are no longer acceptable and tolerated, right? And now the rules of the game are changing, where it's like, well, we can't find any real things which are problematic. So now we've got to go and look for things that and confect that they're problematic. And so now what's happening, I think, is the rules of the game are changing, where it's not just like good enough not to be racist. You've got to have your cape on, and you've got to. And the thing I fear, or the thing that I kind of can see happening, and I see it happening, is this kind of competition where it's like, no,
jockeying.
I'm more anti-racist than you. They're motivated to feel superior to other people. It's self-glorifying, right? It's I'm more woke than you, right? This kind of starts to get into like cultural revolution territory, where, I mean, this conversation that we've just had would get us sent down to the countryside. This is the kind of, and I don't
get, I don't get a free card because I'm actually Chinese.
No. Well, you're the most repressive of them all now, right?
Damn, it always comes around, doesn't it? Okay, let's go to like the more lighthearted side of it. Like, is racism ever okay amongst friends or in the right kind of environments? Where's that line for you?
So I was, I would have been in my early 20s, and I flew to like America. So I landed in LA and just got off like a flight. So you basically, the deal is you arrive, you spend 15, 16 hours on a plane. You arrive in LA and it's like 6 a.m. in the morning, right? So, which is terrible because you're jet lagged and it's not time to even go to bed, right? Because it's 6 a.m. And hotels, by the way, won't let you check in. What do? You arrive in LA and you can't check in, and you're pretty much stranded. You go for a walk, right? You get some breakfast, which is like dinner or whatever. Anyway, so I was walking down this street in LA, and then there's this like black dude. He's on a skateboard. He looks a bit disheveled, like he looks like he could be homeless, but I'm not sure if he's he was homeless or just a bit funky or whatever. Then this white guy just sucker punches him, like, for no reason. Like, they didn't know him, right? Just hit him in the head. And my instinct at that moment was not to check on the dude that's just been hit in the head. My instinct at that moment was just fucking get out of that scene. Because in my mind, like, I've just arrived in LA, something's happened. I know, oh wait, they've got guns and shit here in
Axl
America.
Rose is just punch slash on the side of the road.
But I just wanted to get out of this.
Yeah, remove yourself from
I didn't want to, I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't, like, the white guy ran off. So in my mind, it was like, okay, well, it's like, it's not going to get any worse than what had happened. I don't know what's going to happen, but for, given guns and knives and all, maybe I've got a false sense of what it's like in America, but at least, the fear of the unknown was enough for me to just, for self-preservation reasons, to get out. And then the black guy has just been sucker punched, like, has a crack at me and says, oh, you're like, what are you, like, like this, this guy, this is happening, you just walk away, like, I was like, oh. Then I came back to him and said, oh, look, sorry, I've just arrived, I've just got off a plane, and like, I saw what happened, and I'm, sorry that happened to you, and but like, it did make me think, like, it did make me think about this stuff a bit more, and because of course, like, you'd like to think that you're the person who would help someone out in that situation, but my instincts at that time were not that. My instincts were get the fuck out of there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the context of a lot of these things, whether it's like, these are innate in us, right? These are not things like the tribal mentality. These are things we're born with.
Yeah,
And
look, and there's unconscious bias in there as well, right? Like, there's lots of studies that you have trouble telling people different races apart. Like, you have trouble recognizing that from your own race, right? Or what you're used to, and things like that. Now, you told that story, and I totally agree. Like, in the moment of adrenaline and instinctual, and different parts of the brain take over when there's a threat around. But I want to kind of probe into that. The fact that it was a white guy and a black guy, was that just a red herring, or are you trying to say that you've had to examine some kind of unconscious bias around the situation?
No, because the black guy pulled me up on it. He said, "Oh, this racism in this town, and and in this country or whatever," and like the guy who was hit made it about race, right? And I can't. At the end of the day, like, if someone who sucker punches someone, like, at the end of the day, you can't know what their intentions were, and maybe race had no bearing on it at all. Like, you can't just automatically assume it was a racist attack. But at least in the mind of that person that was hit, it was to do with race, and that, like, that must reflect something in their experiences in their life or whatever.
I think,
but the reason I view it through the lens of race now is because he did.
So he made it about race.
Yeah, I mean, like, me not reacting in his mind was that I was also part of the problem, right? So that made me think, like, I did think about it, right? But, like, actually, and sorry, to the heart of your question, right? Like, is it ever okay to be racist or whatever? Like, I guess there are occasions where, like, through experience, we're kind of like imperfect, probability machines, right? Like, we're assessing the probability of things happening at any given point in time, right? And unfortunately, like, we process information in a way that does perpetuate discrimination. So if, like, I think there's one example that's given in, I can't remember which book, but it's like, it's one of those ones on behavioral economics or behavioral science or whatever, where they say if you've got a vacant, like a room to let out or something, and you have a choice of, a Korean student that wants to apply for the room, or a black person, most, like, people will apply a heuristic that on average, what do we know about Korean people?
Either.
Very clean. What's that?
I wouldn't trust the North Korean either.
Well, North Korea maybe not, but there is this thing of like, we look at, like, law of averages or whatever,
and that's totally okay and useful, right? Like, I'll kind of
but is it though? Like, we're perpetuating. Like, we're looking at someone and discriminating and giving someone less access to things. Like,
in terms of characterizing people and patterns and heuristics and things like that, I'll kind of dob myself in here in a more local example. So I was in my early 20s as well, and it was very, very late at night, a night out on the town. And I remember that we had just caught the train into our central part of the city, and we were walking along, and there was this big group of Aboriginal men, and they were kind of loitering around just outside the train station. It's very late at night, it's dark, we're walking through. And to that point in my life, I'd gone to uni in the city, had been kind of around the kind of that side of the town, and I was very confident in that part of the town. As we were walking past this group of men, one of them, like, lunged out at us and screamed and, like, really abusive things. I'm gonna fucking kill you, and, like, started chasing us and like threw bottles at us and stuff like that. Yeah. And then we were quite shaken up from that experience, right? It was like they were very, very aggressive. They're throwing things at us. One of the people in our group got cut by a bottle. And we were talking about it the next day and saying, like, you know, that's not a great experience, but, you know, we'll go on. Then probably about a month later, the same thing happened again in a similar kind of situation where it's late at night, group of Aboriginal men drinking, and one of them lunged at us and was like abusing us as we were like kind of going away. So after this all happened, right, we were talking in our group and we're saying, like, this is our experience with it. This is our experience with dealing with Aboriginal men at a certain time and a certain kind of context. And due to that fact, we wouldn't be crazy for never putting ourselves in that situation again because of the inherent danger and our experience. Now, I don't think that is racist for us to say that due to our experiences and our kind of understanding of the context of a certain time of night, a certain place in the city, that there is danger associated with Aboriginal men. What would you think of that?
It's tricky because...
A few bad apples?
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of thing that can perpetuate a lot of the stereotypes that actually result in a lot of discrimination against Indigenous Australians persisting today.
That's why I said that time and context, though. So if I...
Yeah, but at the same time, like, what if there's like, you know, what if there's like people out there assisting homeless people, you know, like...
Well, good, but the example that I'm giving, though, is one of personal safety. And I actually think that when it comes to those heuristics and experience and so on, I think that's not the environment to be trying to implement these higher level orders, right?
Well, I guess what the thing with all of this is that if we have these behavioral biases or these things inbuilt into us, we have to work against them to make sure we conceive of the world a bit differently to what those, you know, because we basically have instincts that were fit for us, like on the plains trying to avoid lions, right? Whereas now we're kind of in a more complex society. So in the context of this particular example, I think in placing it and kind of sort of constructing that and trying to work out, well, what does it all mean? You know, I think it's important to place that and try and do the things we need to do so that we don't kind of just conceive that anyone automatically of Indigenous heritage is like going to do that thing that happened to you.
I just want to also talk about the elephant in the room. And I know I talked at the start of this episode a lot about my experiences of racism and how that can leave such a lot of work to do, right? And a lot of kind of things to carry around with you. And hearing about stuff with my relatives and how bad it was back in the day is really heartbreaking. But I do want to acknowledge something that actually minorities are inherently very racist themselves. And it's a very, very common thing for, say, you know, Cantonese background, you know, Chinese heritage to be very racist towards, you know, the Vietnamese or Thai, or like, I think that in some ways the standard that they're held to is very, very different, you know, and they do use a lot of the pattern recognition and shortcuts. Like, for example, you know, it's a common thing in like Chinese culture to think that, you know, it's the worst thing in the world to negotiate with an Indian because they're like they're stingy and so on and all this kind of stuff. And they talk a little bit more freely and there's a little bit more creative expression about those things. So I do want to really call that out and acknowledge that. And you can see that sometimes in some of the culture and the art that they make. Like look at, you know, Fat Pizza and things like in Australia, or Russell Peters and the comedy around there. And I think that for ethnic people, they do like to poke fun at ethnicities in general, and they find that sometimes quite empowering to play with and to make fun of and joke around with. So I think sometimes the sensitivity goes way too far into that Caucasian space, because when you peel back the onion, minorities are very racist in a way.
I think this goes back to the power dynamics. So I guess the question is, if you're not of the dominant culture, like, and let's say there are these sort of comments made, like how status sort of destroying is it that you've got Cantonese people, having a crack at Mandarin people, like people who speak Mandarin, right?
Yeah.
But I guess the other thing is, like, white people have kind of, say white people, I actually really hate the idea of like thinking of myself or as people as white, or as Asian or whatever. Like I just think it's silly. But anyway, as an aside,
do you ever get upset that like your heritage is kind of homogenized? Like there's such a big portion of the Western world that just gets put under
I
Caucasian.
just don't take it seriously. Like, to me, it's just like, I don't and then, someone would say, oh, well, that's of course white privilege, right? But I don't think of myself as anything. Like, to me, this is just a completely redundant concept. And, but I think as a white person, and again, I hate that idea, but like as
but you do feel privileged, right? Like hearing about some of this stuff and not have ever really thought about it, or never had to go through it, experience it.
Well, I've never had an experience where I've been like challenged in this way because I'm white, right? But I think the thing that does frustrate me a little bit now is that as a white person, your job is just to sit and listen and take on board how repressive your people have been. The thing that doesn't sit well with me is the idea that as a white person, I have to be accountable for the things that happened 200 years ago, that white people did 200 years ago, because I don't identify as white, I'm maybe perceived as white, but I don't identify as like a continuous thing. There's some continuous lineage with, and even if you were to say, well, yeah, but like Europeans did all these horrible things in Australia, like, well, even then I say, well, no, because my dad is from fucking England, wasn't in Australia, wasn't part of the privileged class in England. And on my mum's side, I've got Irish heritage. So I fucking have nothing to do with any of this shit.
I kind of feel the same way sometimes. Like for a long time growing up, and I guess this is that part I was telling you about, feeling in between. We go to, school excursions to Canberra, and you'd visit the War Memorial and thing, and like people would be like crying or really touched by it. And because of my immigrant culture, I didn't feel super connected. Like they weren't my relatives that fought and died. They weren't. And then later on, like I guess it's a similar thing. It's like, I guess the counter argument is that no matter what our relatives, our ancestors did or did not do, we still benefit from being here around those conditions.
If there's a notion of like, we're going to acknowledge something that happened, like, and continued injustices or whatever, and so the purpose is to acknowledge and to recognize and go through a healing process, then that's totally like on board with that.
Yeah. And look, and I get the whole, sometimes like that white privilege thing is a pretty rich line. It leaves out lower socioeconomic white people that are definitely feeling a lot of the same issues, right, at a societal level. But I guess like in the racism context that we're talking about today, there definitely is a privilege of not having to go through your life with that impact on you, right? Like never having, say, in my example, a teacher that is meant to be educating you and looking after you, telling you that you're no good because you have a Chinese heritage, right? That's something that most Caucasians won't have to deal with, right? So, I think in that way, whether privilege is the wrong word, that's the kind of thing that I guess people want some vindication on, right? Or want some acknowledgement of.
I think the difference between you and me in terms of this experience you talk about is probably like a generation. So I think if I think about my mum, so like not on my dad's side, but on my mum's side, because there's the Irish Catholic thing, right? Irish Catholic Australians in the 50s were treated, there was, it's hard to say, like it's hard to contemplate like racism against, but there was this whole thing of like Irish Catholics were like the outsiders, right? Like as a Catholic, you were a minority, right? Now, in the case my mum went to a Catholic school, but if my mum went to a normal school, she would have been totally foreseeable that she would have had a teacher to say, "Oh, you Catholics, the thing you need to know is that you Irish Catholic." I mean, I guess there's the whole religion overlay, which makes this a little bit different and more complicated. But that would have been the thing that they would, you Catholics, you really don't understand. You're really actually like bad, or whatever. Like I could totally imagine that conversation happening to my mom, right? But then my experience is like I'm completely. There's no Catholic in me. Like I'm not Catholic now. I'm not Irish Catholic, whatever, right? And I think so. If my mum is like the equivalent of the second generation sort of Australian or whatever, and then I'm the third generation, I guess my hope for you and your children would be that your children would not would never even contemplate or think to experience what you experienced.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I hope that too. And you're probably a little bit slightly more optimistic than me. I feel like people don't change as much; they just learn to hide it. And I think what's actually changed my opinion on that optimism? It's COVID, and talking to relatives, especially in the States, in America. And it's just been this kind of airbag, this kind of front to seep out some of those old attitudes towards Chinese people, and the spate of kind of attacks and verbal and physical have risen around the world due to the Chinese, the Wuhan flu, and they've kind of just used it as an excuse, I think, to let some old things out. And I hope that will kind of course correct, but that's been very unsettling to see.
I think the reason you can be more optimistic is that, and the reason I'm more optimistic, and maybe this is an insider's view, right? Maybe this is the view from my world, right? Which is that I grew up hearing a lot of shit that I know now as being like, I can't believe this was even, thought, like people thought this, right? And when I contrast that with the conversations that I hear now and the views of, the people, who would have perpetrated, like I don't hear these conversations anymore. Or to the extent that people have still, like if you're meeting with older people who's, generational, like even then they'll have a bit more nuance to their racism. I've seen a change in my lifetime, I guess.
Thank you, Waleed, and the project. You said we shouldn't do Aboriginal people, but then you opened the door and I piled on.
I think that little bit there before will be the outro where you say.
But we didn't go to Islam.